Marcus Rodriguez wiped the sweat from his forehead as he walked out of the warehouse doors. Everyone called him Champ because he used to box in high school. Now, at 23 years old, he worked at a big storage building where trucks came and went all day long. His shift had ended 2 hours late again. The supervisor always asked people to stay extra time, but Champ never said no because he needed every dollar he could get. His worn sneakers made soft sounds on the wet pavement as he hurried down the street. The October air was cold and made his breath look like small clouds. Champ pulled his thin jacket tighter around his body. He had been wearing the same jacket for 3 years now. The zipper was broken, and there were small holes near the pockets, but it still kept him warm enough. Champ looked at his old phone to check the time. The screen was cracked, but he could still see the numbers. It was almost 11 at night. The last bus home would come in 15 minutes. If he missed it, he would have to walk for 2 hours to get to his apartment. He had done that walk many times before when he worked too late. His mother was waiting for him at home. She had been sick for 6 months now. The doctors said she needed surgery, but it cost too much money. Champ had been working double shifts and saving every penny he earned. He even stopped buying lunch and only ate the free crackers they gave workers at the warehouse. His stomach made hungry sounds as he walked, but he ignored it. The bus stop was on the other side of the old government building. Champ had walked this way hundreds of times before. It was always quiet at night with just a few streetlights showing the way. But tonight something was different. The whole area looked busy and strange. Black cars were parked everywhere along the street. They were shiny and expensive-looking cars that Champ had never seen in this part of town before. Men in dark suits stood near the cars talking into small devices near their ears. Some of them looked at Champ as he walked by, but they did not stop him. Champ noticed that the old government building had many more lights on than usual. Most nights it was completely dark by this time. Tonight every window seemed to be glowing with bright yellow light. He could see shadows of people moving around inside the building. There were more men in suits standing near the entrance doors. As Champ got closer to his usual path, he saw even more unusual things. There were men wearing fancy military uniforms with gold buttons and colorful ribbons on their chests. Their uniforms looked like something from a movie about kings and queens. The men stood very straight and did not move much. They'd all carried themselves like they were very important people. Champ did not know that inside the building there was a secret meeting happening. Leaders from different countries had come together to talk about important things. They were trying to make peace agreements and solve problems between nations. The meeting was so secret that even most government workers did not know about it. All Champ knew was that he needed to get to his bus stop. He could see the bus coming down the street in the distance. Its headlights cut through the darkness like two bright eyes. If he did not hurry, he would miss it and have to make the long walk home. His mother would worry if he came home too late. Champ tried to walk through what looked like a normal sidewalk area. He had used this path many times before, and it had always been open to everyone. But tonight one of the men in the fancy military uniform stepped right in front of him. The man was tall and had serious eyes. His uniform had more gold decorations than the others. The buttons on his jacket caught the light from the street lamps and sparkled like small stars. He wore white gloves on his hands, and his black boots were so shiny they looked like mirrors. The uniformed man held up his hand like a stop sign. He said something in a language that Champ did not understand. His voice was firm and commanding. He pointed for Champ to turn around and go back the way he came. Champ looked past the man and could see his bus getting closer to the stop. In just a few minutes it would arrive, and then leave without him. He tried to explain to the guard that he just needed to cross to get to the bus stop. He pointed toward the approaching bus and spoke in simple English, hoping the man would understand. But the guard became more serious. He stepped closer to Champ and spoke louder in the foreign language. His face showed no kindness or understanding. To him, Champ was just another person who needed to be kept away from the important meeting happening inside the building. Champ felt frustration building up inside his chest. He had been working for 14 hours. He was hungry and tired and worried about his sick mother. All he wanted was to get home. The bus was so close now that he could hear its engine rumbling down the street. The guard pushed Champ harder this time. His white-gloved hands pressed against Champ's chest and sent him stumbling backward 3 steps. Champ caught his balance and looked up at the tall man in the fancy uniform. The guard's face was serious and cold like a statue. He spoke again in the foreign language, but this time his voice was louder and more angry. Champ could hear his bus getting closer. The engine sound was getting louder, and he could see the bright headlights moving down the street toward his stop. In less than 2 minutes, the bus would arrive. Then it would wait for maybe 30 seconds before driving away. If he missed this bus, he would have to walk home for 2 hours in the cold night air. He tried one more time to explain his situation to the guard. Champ pointed toward the bus stop and then toward the approaching bus. He used simple hand gestures to show that he just wanted to walk across to the other side. He even pulled out his wallet and showed the guard his bus pass to prove he was just a regular working person trying to get home. But the guard did not seem to care about Champ's explanations. Instead, he became more aggressive. He grabbed Champ by the shoulder and started pushing him further away from the building. The guard's grip was strong, and his fingers dug into Champ's arm through his thin jacket. Champ had been patient up until now. He had tried to be polite and understanding. But months of stress and worry about his mother had built up inside him like pressure in a bottle. Working 14-hour days and eating only crackers for lunch had made him weak and tired. Sleeping only 4 hours each night because he worried about medical bills had made his nerves raw and sensitive. When the guard pushed him for the 3rd time, Champ felt something snap inside his mind. All the frustration and fear and exhaustion came rushing out at once. His body moved before his brain could stop it. The boxing training from his high school days came back to him like muscle memory. Champ pulled his right arm back and made a tight fist. He twisted his body the way his old coach had taught him. Then he threw a quick, straight punch that cut through the air like a bullet. His knuckles connected with the guard's jaw with a solid thud that echoed off the nearby buildings. The sound was sharp and clear in the quiet night air. It was like someone had cracked a piece of wood in half. The punch landed perfectly on the left side of the guard's face, just below his cheekbone. The impact sent shockwaves up Champ's arm and made his hand sting with pain. The guard staggered backward with his eyes wide open in complete shock. His fancy military hat flew off his head and landed on the wet pavement with a soft thud. Without the hat, his hair was messy and made him look much younger than before. His mouth fell open, and he raised his hand to touch the spot where Champ had hit him. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze like a photograph. The guard stood there touching his jaw with a look of total disbelief on his face. Champ stood with his fist still raised, staring at what he had just done. The bus continued moving down the street, getting closer to the stop. The men in dark suits near the cars had not noticed what happened yet. Then Champ saw something in the guard's eyes that made his blood turn cold. It was not anger or rage like he expected. Instead, it was surprise and hurt, and something else that looked almost like fear. The guard was just a young man, probably not much older than Champ himself. His uniform made him look important and powerful, but underneath he was just a person doing his job. The guard slowly straightened up and looked directly at Champ. His left cheek was already starting to swell and turn red. A thin line of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. He touched it with his white glove and stared at the red stain on the fabric. Champ realized in that terrible moment that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. His hand was still in a fist, but now it was shaking. The anger that had driven him to throw the punch was gone. In its place was a cold fear that spread through his body like ice water. The guard opened his mouth to speak, but before any words came out, whistles started blowing from every direction. The sharp, piercing sounds cut through the night air like sirens. Men in dark suits came running from the parked cars. More guards in fancy uniforms appeared from doorways and corners. Champ heard his bus pulling up to the stop behind him. The doors opened with a hiss, and he could hear a few passengers getting off. Then the doors closed again, and the bus drove away into the darkness. The red tail lights disappeared around a corner, taking with them Champ's last hope of getting home easily. But missing the bus was now the least of his problems. Footsteps were running toward him from all directions. Radio voices crackled in the air, speaking urgent words in multiple languages. Camera flashes started popping from windows in nearby buildings. Champ looked at the young guard who was still holding his swollen jaw. Their eyes met for just a second. In that moment, both of them knew that everything had changed forever. Neither of their lives would ever be the same again. The guard was not just any guard, and Champ was about to learn exactly how big his mistake really was. Within seconds, the entire street turned into complete madness. The whistles kept blowing from every direction, making sharp sounds that hurt Champ's ears. Men in dark suits ran toward him from the parked cars with their hands reaching inside their jackets. More guards in fancy uniforms came rushing out of the government building like water bursting from a dam. Champ stood frozen in place, watching the chaos unfold around him. His heart was beating so fast it felt like it might explode in his chest. The young guard he had punched was still holding his swollen jaw, but now he was trying to wave his other hand at the approaching men. He seemed to be telling them to slow down or stop, but they were not listening to him. Radio voices crackled through the air in at least 3 different languages. The men in suits were talking rapidly into small devices near their mouths. Some of them were pointing at Champ, while others were forming a circle around both him and the injured guard. Their faces were serious and focused, like they were handling a dangerous criminal. Champ raised both his hands up high in the air to show he was not going to fight anymore. He wanted everyone to see that he was surrendering peacefully. His voice was shaky as he tried to speak, but the noise around him was too loud. Nobody seemed interested in hearing what he had to say anyway. The guard with the swollen jaw slowly got back to his feet. His fancy military hat was still lying on the wet ground, looking dirty and damaged. Without the hat, his brown hair was messy and stuck to his forehead with sweat. He looked much younger now, and his face showed pain and confusion, instead of the serious authority from before. What surprised Champ most was that the young guard did not look angry. Instead, he looked worried and almost scared. His eyes kept moving between Champ and all the men who were surrounding them. He said something in the foreign language, but his voice was quiet and hard to hear over all the shouting and radio noise. More people started appearing from everywhere. Guards came running from other buildings nearby. Police cars arrived with their blue and red lights flashing against the dark windows of the government building. The lights made everything look like a strange dream, where colors kept changing from blue to red to white, and back again. Then Champ heard a sound that made his stomach drop like a stone. Camera clicks were coming from the windows of nearby buildings. Bright flashes kept popping like lightning in the darkness. Photographers and reporters had been waiting near the government building to cover whatever meeting was happening inside. Now they had a much more exciting story to photograph and write about. A man with a large camera pushed through the crowd of guards and took pictures of Champ's face. The flash was so bright it made Champ blink and see spots of light dancing in his vision. More cameras appeared and the clicking sounds got faster and louder. Champ realized that his face would probably be in newspapers and on websites by morning. The young guard tried to turn away from the cameras, but it was too late. The photographers had already taken dozens of pictures of his swollen face and messy hair. His white gloves now had small spots of blood on them from touching his injured jaw. The gold buttons on his uniform caught the camera flashes and sparkled like tiny stars. A man in an expensive-looking suit pushed through the crowd and started talking rapidly to the injured guard. This man seemed very important because other people stepped back to give him space. He looked angry and worried at the same time. His face was red, and he kept pointing at Champ while talking to the guard. Champ tried to understand what was happening, but everything was moving too fast. More police officers arrived and started pushing the photographers back away from the scene. Yellow tape was being stretched around the area to keep people out. Ambulance sirens were getting louder as they approached from somewhere in the distance. The injured guard was now sitting on the steps of the government building with a white cloth pressed against his jaw. A man who looked like a doctor was examining his face and asking him questions. The guard kept shaking his head and pointing at Champ, while talking quietly to the doctor and the important man in the expensive suit. Champ noticed that all the men in fancy uniforms were treating the injured guard with special respect. They were not just helping him because he was hurt. They were acting like he was someone very important. Much more important than a regular security guard should be. The way they spoke to him and looked at him made Champ start to worry that he had made an even bigger mistake than he thought. Two police officers approached Champ with handcuffs ready. They were not rough with him, but they were very serious. One of them started reading him his rights while the other one put the metal cuffs around his wrists. The metal was cold against his skin and made clicking sounds as they tightened. As they led him toward a police car, Champ looked back at the young guard one more time. Their eyes met across the crowded street. The guard was still holding the cloth against his face, but he was watching Champ with an expression that was hard to understand. It was not hatred or anger. It was something else entirely. Champ had no idea that the person he had punched was not just any guard. He was about to learn a truth that would make this night even more unbelievable than it already was. Champ sat in the back of the police car with his hands cuffed behind him. The metal handcuffs were digging into his wrists and making his fingers feel numb. Through the window he could see the chaos still continuing outside the government building. More news vans were arriving and reporters were setting up cameras and bright lights that made the street look like daytime. The two police officers in the front seat were talking quietly to each other, but Champ could hear some of their conversation. They seemed confused about what had happened and kept asking each other questions that neither of them could answer. One officer kept saying this was bigger than anything he had ever seen before. Then the radio in the police car started making noise. A voice spoke through the static in clear English that made Champ's blood turn to ice water in his veins. The voice said that the person who had been assaulted was not a regular security guard. He was Prince Alexander, the 19-year-old son of King Frederick from the neighboring country of Valdoria. Champ felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. He could not breathe properly, and his vision became blurry around the edges. A prince. He had punched a real prince in the face. Not just any prince, but the son of a king from another country. This was not just assault anymore. This was an international incident that could cause problems between entire nations. The radio voice continued with more information that made everything worse. Prince Alexander had been participating in a special diplomatic security training program. He wanted to learn about security work from the ground level, so he could better understand how to protect people when he became king someday. Nobody was supposed to know who he really was during the training. The secret meeting happening in the government building was even more important than Champ had imagined. Leaders from 6 different countries were working on peace agreements that could end conflicts that had been going on for decades. Prince Alexander was there as a symbol of the younger generation who wanted peace instead of war. Now, because of one tired warehouse worker's punch, the entire peace summit was in danger. The radio reported that some countries were already talking about pulling out of the negotiations. They said it was not safe to continue meetings in a place where their representatives could be attacked by random citizens. Champ listened to all this information while staring out the car window at the flashing lights and busy crowds. His whole body felt numb, like he was watching someone else's nightmare instead of living his own. This morning he had been just another working person trying to pay his mother's medical bills. Tonight he was an international criminal who had attacked royalty. The police officers were getting more radio updates every few minutes. Each new piece of information made the situation sound worse. Television news stations from around the world were picking up the story. Social media was already full of pictures and videos of the incident. Champ's face was being shared on websites in dozens of different languages. One of the officers turned around to look at Champ through the metal screen that separated the front and back seats. His expression was a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. He asked Champ if he had any idea who he had punched. When Champ shook his head, the officer told him he had just created the biggest diplomatic crisis in 20 years. Through all the radio chatter, Champ learned more details about Prince Alexander. He was studying international relations at university, and spoke 5 different languages. He was known for caring about social issues and helping poor families in his own country. The prince had specifically asked to work as a regular guard during the summit because he wanted to understand what security felt like from a normal person's perspective. The irony made Champ feel sick to his stomach. Here was a young prince who cared about regular working people, and Champ had punched him in the face. If he had known who the guard really was, he would have found another way to get to his bus stop. He would have walked around the entire building if necessary. But there was no way to take back what had already happened. The punch had been thrown and photographed and broadcast around the world. Prince Alexander was at the hospital getting his jaw examined by doctors. Kings and presidents were being woken up in the middle of the night to deal with this crisis. The radio reported that Prince Alexander's father, King Frederick, was flying in on a private jet with a team of diplomats and lawyers. Other royal families were sending representatives to figure out what should happen next. The Prime Minister was holding emergency meetings with his advisors about how to handle the situation. Champ thought about his mother waiting at home for him to return from work. She would be worried when he did not come home at his usual time. By morning, she would probably see his face on the news and learn that her son was in jail for attacking a prince. The stress of that news might make her sickness worse. He also thought about his job at the warehouse. There was no way they would keep him employed after this scandal. Even if he somehow got out of jail eventually, no other company would want to hire someone who had an international incident on their criminal record. His dreams of saving enough money for his mother's surgery were completely destroyed. The police car started moving toward the station where Champ would be processed and put in a holding cell. As they drove away from the government building, he could see the crowd of reporters and photographers getting bigger. News helicopters were circling overhead with bright searchlights pointed down at the street. In just 5 minutes, his entire life had been turned upside down. One moment of frustration and exhaustion had created consequences that would affect not just him, but potentially the relationships between multiple countries. He had wanted to get home to his sick mother, and instead he had started an international crisis. The worst part was not knowing what would happen to him next. How do you punish someone for punching a prince? What kind of sentence do they give for accidentally disrupting peace negotiations between nations? Champ was about to find out that sometimes the most unexpected people can surprise you in the most unexpected ways. While Champ sat in a cold holding cell, convinced that his life was completely ruined, something very different was happening at the city hospital. Prince Alexander was sitting on an examination table while a doctor carefully checked his swollen jaw. The prince kept touching the bruised area and wincing slightly, but he seemed more thoughtful than angry about what had happened. The hospital room was full of important people. Diplomats in expensive suits were talking quietly in corners while security guards stood by every door and window. The prince's personal advisor kept asking if he wanted to make a statement to the press about seeking maximum punishment for his attacker. But Prince Alexander just shook his head and asked them all to be quiet for a moment. The doctor finished his examination and told the prince that nothing was broken. The swelling would go down in a few days, and the bruising would fade in about a week. Some ice and pain medication would be enough treatment. The doctor seemed relieved that the injury was not serious because treating hurt royalty was not something that happened every day. While everyone else in the room was talking about lawyers and criminal charges, Prince Alexander found himself thinking about something completely different. He kept remembering the look in the attacker's eyes just before the punch happened. It had not been the look of an angry criminal or a violent person. It had been the look of someone who was desperate and exhausted and pushed beyond his limits. The prince had noticed other things too during those few seconds before everything went crazy. The man's clothes were old and worn from hard work. His hands had calluses that showed he did physical labor for a living. His shoes were falling apart and had been repaired multiple times with tape and glue. Most importantly, the man had been pointing frantically at a bus that was approaching down the street. Against all advice from his security team and diplomatic advisors, Prince Alexander asked to speak with the detective who was investigating the case. He wanted to know more about the person who had punched him. This request shocked everyone in the room because victims of assault usually wanted nothing to do with learning about their attackers. The detective arrived within an hour carrying a file folder with information about Marcus Rodriguez. He told the prince that the attacker was 23 years old and worked at a warehouse loading and unloading trucks. He had no criminal record and no history of violence. His neighbors described him as a quiet, hard-working person who kept to himself and never caused any trouble. But then the detective shared information that made Prince Alexander sit up straighter and pay closer attention. Marcus lived with his sick mother who had been diagnosed with cancer 6 months ago. The medical bills were enormous, and the family had no insurance to help pay for treatment. Marcus had been working double shifts and sometimes triple shifts trying to save money for his mother's surgery. The detective explained that Marcus had been walking to and from work every day to save bus fare. The money he would have spent on transportation was going into a jar at home marked for medical expenses. On the night of the incident, he had worked 14 hours straight and was trying to catch the last bus home when the confrontation happened. Prince Alexander listened to all this information in complete silence. His advisors were getting impatient and kept reminding him that he needed to make decisions about pressing charges and demanding punishment. But the prince just asked for more details about Marcus and his mother's condition. The detective told him that the mother needed surgery that would cost more than Marcus could earn in 2 years, even working overtime every day. Without the surgery, the cancer would continue to spread, and she would probably die within 6 months. The family had applied for charity assistance from hospitals, but there were waiting lists that were years long. This information hit Prince Alexander like a second punch to the face. Here was a young man exactly his own age who was working himself to exhaustion trying to save his mother's life, while the prince lived in palaces and had every need taken care of by servants. Marcus was eating crackers for lunch and walking for hours to save money for medical bills. The prince's personal advisor interrupted the conversation to remind him that the media was waiting for a statement. Television crews from around the world wanted to know what punishment the prince would demand for this attack on royalty. The diplomatic consequences were getting more serious every hour and decisions needed to be made quickly. But Prince Alexander surprised everyone in the room by asking a question that nobody expected. He wanted to know if there was any way to arrange a private meeting with Marcus Rodriguez, not to confront him or demand apologies, but simply to talk with him person to person. He wanted to hear Marcus tell his own story in his own words. His security chief immediately said this was impossible and dangerous. Meeting with someone who had already attacked him once could lead to more violence. The diplomatic advisors agreed that it would send the wrong message to the world if a prince sat down for friendly conversations with people who assaulted him. But Prince Alexander had made up his mind. He was tired of being surrounded by people who made all his decisions for him. This incident had shown him something about the real world that all his royal education had never taught him. He wanted to understand what desperation felt like and what it meant to have no choices left when someone you love is dying. The prince stood up from the examination table and straightened his shirt. His jaw still hurt and would be sore for days, but his mind was clearer than it had been in months. He told everyone in the room that he was going to do something that would surprise them all. He was going to make a decision that would change not just his own life, but also the life of the young man sitting in a jail cell waiting to learn his fate. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is choose compassion when everyone expects them to choose revenge. Prince Alexander walked into the police station at 8 in the morning looking very different from the night before. Instead of his fancy military uniform, he wore simple blue jeans and a plain white shirt. His face still showed bruising along his jaw, but his eyes were calm and determined. The bandage on his cheek was smaller now, and his brown hair was neatly combed. The police officers and detectives could not believe that a real prince was walking through their station. They had dealt with celebrities and politicians before, but never actual royalty. Everyone stopped what they were doing to stare as he passed by their desks. Some officers took pictures with their phones, while others just stood with their mouths open in amazement. The chief of police met Prince Alexander at the front desk and escorted him to a small meeting room. The chief kept apologizing for the plain appearance of the room and offered to find somewhere more suitable for such an important visitor. But the prince said the simple room was perfect for what he wanted to do. Marcus was brought from his holding cell, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. His hair was messy from sleeping on a hard bench, and his eyes were red from not getting much rest. The handcuffs had been removed, but his wrists still showed red marks where the metal had pressed against his skin. When Marcus walked into the meeting room and saw Prince Alexander sitting at the small table, his legs almost gave out from shock. He had expected to meet with lawyers or judges, or maybe a diplomat. He never imagined he would be face to face with the person he had punched. The bruising on the prince's face made Marcus feel sick with guilt and regret. Prince Alexander stood up and gestured for Marcus to sit down across from him. A translator sat nearby ready to help if needed, but the prince spoke perfect English with only a slight accent. His voice was calm and friendly, which confused Marcus even more. He had expected anger or demands for severe punishment. The prince began by asking Marcus simple questions about his life. Where did he work, and how long had he been doing that job? What was his daily routine like, and how many hours did he usually work each week? These were not the kinds of questions Marcus had expected from someone he had assaulted the night before. Marcus answered carefully at first, thinking this might be some kind of trap. But Prince Alexander listened with genuine interest and asked follow-up questions that showed he really cared about the answers. Slowly, Marcus began to relax and speak more naturally about his life at the warehouse and his struggles to make ends meet. When the conversation turned to his mother, Marcus' voice began to shake with emotion. He explained how she had been the strongest person he knew until the cancer diagnosis changed everything. She had raised him alone after his father left when he was 12 years old. She had worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table and clothes on his back. The prince listened without interrupting as Marcus described his mother's condition and the expensive surgery she needed. He talked about working double shifts and eating only crackers for lunch to save money. He explained how he had been walking to and from work every day to put bus fare into the medical fund jar at home. Marcus told the prince about the night everything went wrong, how tired he had been after 14 hours of loading trucks, how worried he was about missing the last bus and having to walk home in the cold, how frustrated and desperate he felt when the guard kept pushing him away from his usual path to the bus stop. As Marcus spoke, Prince Alexander saw tears forming in the young man's eyes. This was not a violent criminal or an angry protester. This was someone who had been pushed beyond his breaking point by circumstances completely outside his control. The punch had not come from hatred or evil intentions. It had come from months of stress and exhaustion and fear about losing his mother. When Marcus finished telling his story, he looked down at his hands and waited for the prince to respond. He expected anger or demands for punishment, or at least some harsh words about his behavior. Instead, Prince Alexander was quiet for a long moment, just thinking about everything he had heard. Finally, the prince spoke, and his words were not what anyone in the room expected to hear. He said that he was not going to press criminal charges against Marcus Rodriguez. He would not be seeking jail time or demanding any punishment through the legal system. This announcement shocked the translator and the police officers who were listening from outside the room. But Prince Alexander was not finished talking. He said that the incident had opened his eyes to problems he had never fully understood before. He had grown up in palaces with servants and unlimited money, while people like Marcus were working themselves to exhaustion just to keep their families alive. The punch had hurt his face for a few minutes, but learning about Marcus' situation had affected his heart permanently. The prince announced that his family foundation would pay for all of Marcus' mother's medical treatments, including the surgery she needed immediately. They would also cover any follow-up care and medications she might need during her recovery. Marcus would not have to work triple shifts anymore just to afford basic medical care for someone he loved. Marcus stared at the prince in complete disbelief. After expecting the worst punishment possible, he was hearing about generosity that seemed impossible to believe. He asked if this was really happening or if he was dreaming in his jail cell. The prince smiled and assured him it was completely real. But there would be conditions attached to this offer. Prince Alexander wanted Marcus to help him understand more about the struggles that working families faced every day. He wanted to learn about real life outside the protected world of royalty. In return for the medical assistance, Marcus would work with the prince's foundation to identify other families who needed help. Marcus agreed immediately without even thinking about it. He would have agreed to almost anything to save his mother's life. But as he listened to more details about what the prince had in mind, he realized this was about much more than just one family getting help. This was about creating real change that could help thousands of people. The meeting ended with both young men feeling like their lives had been completely transformed in just 1 hour of honest conversation. Outside the room, reporters were gathering to hear what punishment would be announced. They had no idea they were about to witness something much more powerful than revenge. At 10 o'clock in the morning, Prince Alexander walked out of the police station and faced the largest crowd of reporters and photographers he had ever seen. News crews from dozens of countries had gathered outside the building. Camera crews lined both sides of the street, and satellite trucks filled every available parking space. The crowd was so big that police had to set up barriers to keep everyone organized. The prince walked slowly to a small platform that had been set up with microphones from different television stations. His jaw still showed clear signs of bruising, and the bandage on his cheek was visible to everyone watching. He looked calm and confident despite all the cameras pointing at him and the hundreds of people waiting to hear what he would say. Behind Prince Alexander stood Marcus Rodriguez, looking nervous and confused about why he was there. Marcus had expected to be led back to a jail cell after their meeting. Instead, the prince had asked him to stay for the press conference. Marcus wore the same work clothes from the night before and looked very different from the well-dressed reporters and diplomats in the crowd. The prince began speaking in clear English so that reporters from around the world could understand him without needing translators. His voice was strong and steady as he told the crowd that he had an important announcement to make about the incident from the previous night. He started by explaining that Marcus Rodriguez would not face any criminal charges for what had happened. There would be no jail time or fines or legal punishment of any kind. This announcement caused an immediate reaction from the crowd of reporters. Camera flashes started popping rapidly, and several journalists shouted questions trying to understand why. Prince Alexander raised his hand for quiet and continued with his prepared statement. He said that the incident had taught him valuable lessons about the struggles that ordinary working people face every day. He had learned about families who could not afford basic medical care and parents who worked multiple jobs just to survive. The prince explained that Marcus had been trying to get home to his sick mother after working a 14-hour shift at a warehouse. He had been walking to save money for her medical treatments when the confrontation occurred. The punch had not come from violence or hatred, but from desperation and exhaustion that most people could not imagine. Instead of seeking punishment, Prince Alexander announced that his royal family foundation would pay for all medical expenses for Marcus' mother, including the surgery she needed immediately. The crowd of reporters started talking loudly among themselves, because this was not the kind of announcement they had expected to hear. But the prince was not finished with his surprises. He said that this incident had inspired him to create a new international program to help families facing medical emergencies they could not afford. The program would be funded by royal families and wealthy donors from multiple countries working together. Prince Alexander looked directly into the television cameras as he spoke about how the punch had hurt his face for only a few minutes, but learning about Marcus' situation and the struggles of families like his had affected him in ways that would last forever. He said that sometimes painful experiences can teach us the most important lessons about life. The prince introduced Marcus to the crowd and asked him to tell his own story about working to save his mother's life. Marcus was terrified of speaking in front of so many cameras, but he managed to explain about his mother's cancer and the expensive treatments she needed. His voice shook with emotion as he thanked the prince for his incredible generosity. Social media immediately exploded with reactions to the press conference. Some people praised Prince Alexander for his compassion and maturity in handling the situation. They said he had shown real leadership by choosing understanding over revenge. Videos of his speech were shared millions of times within the first hour. But not everyone was happy with the prince's decision. Some people felt that attacking royalty should be punished severely regardless of the circumstances. They worried that letting Marcus go free would encourage other people to think they could assault important officials without consequences. Political leaders from around the world had mixed reactions to the announcement. Some praised the prince for his wisdom and humanitarian approach to solving the crisis. Others questioned whether showing mercy to someone who had committed assault against a royal family member would damage respect for authority. The diplomatic summit that had been interrupted by the incident was able to resume later that day. The other world leaders were impressed by how Prince Alexander had handled the situation, and several of them mentioned his maturity in their own statements to the press. The peace negotiations continued and actually became more productive because of the positive attention. Marcus' mother watched the press conference from her hospital bed, where she was preparing for surgery the next morning. She cried tears of joy and relief, knowing that her son was not going to prison and that she would finally receive the medical treatment she needed. The stress of worrying about medical bills had been making her sickness worse, but now she could focus on getting better. Television news programs around the world led with the story of the prince who chose compassion over punishment. Talk shows and news websites analyzed every word of his speech and praised his decision to turn a negative incident into something positive. Public opinion polls showed that most people supported his actions. The warehouse where Marcus worked was overwhelmed with phone calls from reporters wanting to interview his coworkers and supervisors. His boss told journalists that Marcus was the hardest working and most reliable employee he had ever had. Other workers described him as someone who always helped others and never complained even when asked to work extra hours. By evening, the story had become one of the most discussed news events of the year. The hashtag about the prince and the punch was trending worldwide on social media. People were sharing their own stories about struggling to afford medical care and praising both young men for their courage in turning conflict into cooperation. Prince Alexander returned to his hotel room exhausted but satisfied with how the day had gone. He knew that some people would criticize his decision, but he felt confident that he had done the right thing. Sometimes being a leader meant making choices that not everyone would understand or approve of. Marcus went home to his small apartment for the first time in over 24 hours. His mother would have her surgery in the morning, and her chances of recovery were excellent according to the doctors. As he sat in his kitchen looking at the jar of coins he had been saving for medical bills, he could hardly believe how much his life had changed in just one day. 3 weeks after the press conference that changed both their lives, Prince Alexander and Marcus Rodriguez met again at the city hospital. Marcus' mother was recovering well from her surgery, and the doctors said the cancer treatment was working better than they had hoped. She would need more treatments over the next few months, but her chances of full recovery were now very good. Prince Alexander had been visiting the hospital regularly to check on her progress. At first, these visits were formal and brief, with royal security guards standing nearby and hospital staff treating him like an important dignitary. But as the weeks passed, the visits became more relaxed and personal. Marcus' mother enjoyed talking with the young prince about her life and her son. She told him stories about raising Marcus alone after his father left, and how proud she was of his hard work and dedication. She described the sacrifices he had made to try to pay for her medical bills, and how he had never complained even when things got very difficult. The prince listened to these stories with growing respect for both Marcus and his mother. He had never met people who faced such serious challenges with so much dignity and strength. His own life had been filled with luxury and privilege, but he was learning that real courage came from people who kept fighting even when everything seemed hopeless. Marcus found himself looking forward to the prince's visits as well. At first he had been nervous and formal around royalty, but Prince Alexander made it clear that he wanted to be treated like a normal person. They began having real conversations about their lives, their dreams, and their very different experiences growing up. Despite coming from completely opposite worlds, the two young men discovered they had many things in common. Both cared deeply about their families, and wanted to make positive differences in the world. Both felt pressure to live up to expectations that sometimes seemed impossible to meet. Both struggled with finding their own path in life while dealing with responsibilities they had not chosen. Prince Alexander began visiting Marcus' family apartment, as well as the hospital. The small two-bedroom place was nothing like the palaces he was used to, but he felt more comfortable there than in many of the fancy buildings where he usually spent his time. Marcus' mother cooked simple meals for them, and they would sit around the kitchen table talking for hours. These conversations taught Prince Alexander more about real life than all his years of royal education combined. He learned what it meant to worry about paying rent and buying groceries. He heard about the stress of working multiple jobs and still not having enough money for basic needs. He began to understand how different life was for families who did not have wealth and privilege to protect them. Marcus also learned from their friendship, but in different ways. The prince showed him that wealthy and powerful people could still be kind and caring individuals. He had always assumed that rich people did not understand or care about the problems of working families. Prince Alexander proved that assumption wrong through his actions and genuine concern. The prince began asking Marcus to accompany him to diplomatic events and charity functions. These formal gatherings had always felt boring and meaningless to Prince Alexander before, but having Marcus there to explain how the discussed policies would affect real families made the events much more interesting and important. Marcus felt very out of place at first among all the well-dressed diplomats and wealthy donors, but Prince Alexander made sure he was included in conversations and introduced him as an advisor on social issues. Gradually, Marcus became more comfortable speaking up about the needs of working families and the challenges they faced. Their friendship became a powerful symbol that crossed social boundaries and inspired people around the world. News stories were written about the prince and the warehouse worker who had become close friends after such an unlikely beginning. Social media was filled with photos of them visiting hospitals together and working on charity projects. The prince's foundation grew rapidly as more donors wanted to support their work, helping families with medical emergencies. Marcus helped identify families who needed assistance and made sure the help reached people who really needed it most. His experience of being poor and desperate made him the perfect person to understand who deserved help and who might be trying to take advantage of the system. Other royal families from different countries began asking Prince Alexander for advice about connecting with ordinary citizens in their own nations. His approach of building real friendships instead of just making formal appearances was getting attention from leaders around the world. Marcus quit his job at the warehouse and began working full-time for the prince's foundation. His new salary was more than he had ever earned before, and his mother no longer had to worry about medical bills or other expenses. But more importantly, he felt like his work was making a real difference in people's lives. The friendship between the prince and Marcus also changed how both of them thought about their futures. Prince Alexander realized that being a good leader meant understanding the struggles of all citizens, not just the wealthy and powerful ones. Marcus discovered that he had talents for helping people and organizing assistance programs that he had never known about before. Their mothers also became friends during this time. The prince's mother, Queen Isabella, visited Marcus' mother several times during her recovery. Despite their very different backgrounds, the two women found they had much in common as mothers who loved their sons and wanted the best for them. 6 months after the night that brought them together, Prince Alexander and Marcus had become genuine best friends. They spent most of their free time working together on foundation projects or just talking about life and their plans for the future. The punch that had seemed like such a disaster had actually brought together two people who made each other better human beings. Their friendship proved that understanding and compassion could bridge any gap between people, no matter how different their backgrounds might be. It showed the world that sometimes the most unexpected encounters can lead to the most beautiful relationships.